Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guests today are Amy Goodman and her brother, David Goodman, a journalist, and we'll discuss the book they wrote, The Exception to the Rulers, Exposing Oily Politicians, War Profiteers, and the Media That Love Them. Welcome to Rip Rap.
It's great to be with you.
This is a fantastic book, and I really enjoy the opportunity to talk with you about it. And if there was, each book is kind of interesting, but this is a bit of a stretch for us because our stated purpose is to interview authors of academic books. But the book that the two of you wrote deals with academic issues, and so I'd like to talk about, how the project evolved.
Well, starting by looking at the state of the media today, and realizing that the media's really hit an all-time low in the lead-up to the invasion of Iraq and the occupation. The networks, the main papers of record like the New York Times, simply beating the drums for war. And that's not what we're supposed to be doing. I mean, any first-year journalism student will tell you some basic rules, and that is we're supposed to be holding those in power accountable. But as people rise up their career ladder, it seems they go further and further away from the basic tenets of journalism that many are taught in journalism schools. There's a reason why our profession is the only one explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution. We're supposed to be the check and balance on government. But what David and I call in the book the access of evil is trading truth for access. You come back with a quote of Donald Rumsfeld or the Vice President Dick Cheney, you rise in your career ladder, and what's the price you have paid for that? Well, the kind of coverage you do that gets you that access. We don't think the access is worth it. The politicians need us more than we need them, and it's our job to hold them accountable.
Well, and as I read it, I noticed you mentioned I.F. Stone, who's one of my heroes, and I yearn for the days when we had the I.F. Stones. I think you're well within that tradition, both of you. But the concern I have also is that with the attacks being made on the media and the intensity of them, is having this kind of silencing that you only see in fascist regimes.
Well, the crackdown is very serious, both inside the academy and outside. And the academy extends beyond colleges and universities, but high schools as well. I mean, David, you come from Vermont, where one of the examples we gave happened, the story of Tom Treese in Barre, Vermont.
Right. We see this, the intent, the crackdown that we write about in the book, a variety of things, including the crackdown on civil liberties around the country. And there were so many instances in which civil liberties are being routinely trampled that we give what we call a crackdown sampler. And one of them that Amy's referring to occurred in Vermont, where I live, in which a teacher who is a pacifist teacher, also a very provocative teacher, getting students to debate issues of war and peace, encouraging them to post their feelings and ideas on a school bulletin board. A local police officer in uniform, although claiming to be on a break, went into the school at 1:30 a.m., intimidated a janitor into letting him in, took photographs of the teacher's classroom, which had all kinds of posters and whatnot, and the photos later appeared on the website of Rush Limbaugh, the arch-conservative talk show host and admitted drug abuser. And Tom Treese, the teacher, was removed from teaching this current affairs class, and it took him 2 years with his union fighting for him to get back the teaching of this class. He didn't lose his job, that was the good news, but the bad news was this is one teacher in one school and what he's had to go through just to do his regular job.
And at the university level, it's very frightening what's happening in this post-9/11, post-USA Patriot Act era, where increasingly foreign students are simply not welcome. We took the example of Johns Hopkins University, the School of Public Health. I mean, these are some of the preeminent health universities in the country. They, over the years, have researchers overseas, researchers from other places coming here. This is extremely important because Diseases know no borders. I mean, when you have epidemics, when you're dealing with issues like SARS and with AIDS, you need the open dialogue. You need the research to go all over the world. You need scientists cooperating. But when you have scientists who've been for years coming to this country, who make their way to, let's say, to Johns Hopkins, and they are taken in by customs and detained and put in jail, this is not going to help what really is a danger to national security. Students afraid to come to this country. Now some of the finest students from abroad going elsewhere, they're saying, why bother coming here and possibly being put in jail? I'll go to Canada. I'll go to another place in Europe. Not to mention they bring in money to this school, to this country. Deans of universities are very concerned about what's happening. We have an example in our chapter on crackdown. A student in Colorado. He was an Iranian student, came to school here. His name was Yasher Zendadel. And he had to go in a voluntary registration in the period where people from almost all Muslim countries, men over the age of 16, had to go and register. These have very ominous overtones, but went to register. And he was thrown in jail. Was it because of, as well, we put it in a multiple choice question, was it because he was wanted for murder, or B, rape, or C, robbery, or D, because he didn't take enough college credits? Yes, the answer is D. He had dropped one of his classes at the advice of his advisor because he was switching majors. And the next semester, he was going to pick up an extra course. But under the very stringent rules, you had to take a full course load as a foreign student. And so he was put in jail, and it was only the persistence of his university, as well as his friends, that raised $5,000 to get him out of jail. Now, this sends a very scary message to students. You're not wanted in this country, and I don't think that is the message we want to send. The answer to terrorism is to open up discourse, to make people feel free all over the world to converse. It's communication. It's bridging cultural barriers, not erecting them, as the Bush administration is now doing.
When you talk in the book about the computer database that's tracking all the movements of international students, well, and just in general, everybody's
the CVIS
movements,
program.
yeah, being tracked through computer database information.
Very scary, linking students' information to the ports of entry, to the top intelligence agencies of this country. I mean, you have the heads of universities calling together the deans and professors saying, do not make a mistake when you enter this information about foreign students. Because if you change a grade, if you get their name wrong. For example, one of the things that a student has to do is report within 10 days if they move. Now, we're talking about college kids, a freshman. How often do you move down the hall? What if you forget to report you move from this dorm room to this dorm room? You can be deported, you can be detained, you can be arrested. If you change a grade, if you get a name change wrong. Now you might say, have they never taken down this information in the past? They have, but it hasn't been centralized in this way where these mistakes could be picked up. It might be put in a closet at some university. And now with this concentration of information, not to mention surveillance and monitoring, and it's not just foreign students. It's all of us, and that's very important to point out. This is just the sort of litmus test, and if people don't stand up now, it's eventually going to come to everyone. We have a quote in our book by Martin Niemöller, famous quote from World War II, the pastor saying, first they came for the socialists. I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't stand up. Then they came for the trade unionists. I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't stand up. They came for the Jews and the Catholics. I was neither, so I didn't stand up. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to stand up. It's very important we stand up together, or we will be picked off one by one.
Well, you talk in the book about how high school students' records are being given to military recruiters, and unless they sign a waiver.
That is, in fact, the default position now, and that viewers should be aware of that, that their sons and daughters in high school now, the default policy of the schools is to provide the student information to military recruiters. This is part of the so-called Education Act, known as No Child Left Behind. Of course, it has nothing to do with education. It has to do with filling the ranks of the military. Unless a parent signs a letter that specifically removes their child's name from the list. Their children's names are being provided to the recruiters. This was never done before. This is new. Recruiters in the past have had to find kids at the malls, at the sports games, wherever it is they do it. And, they haven't had a problem filling the ranks of the military until now. And, of course, the problem now is a very unpopular war and an illegal war in Iraq that people don't want to sign up for the military. So now they're digging deep and turning the schools into frontline recruiting centers.
I mean, it's so important, and David wrote a really good piece on this in Mother Jones magazine, but the idea that it's not, if you want to sign up here, and your name will be passed on. It's that the roster, the entire student body's names are just handed over unless a parent knows, or the kid, him or herself knows, to say, do not hand my name over. Often parents are not told about this policy, so they don't know to say no. And you give examples, David, of in cases where the principal has the letter sent home to say, do you want your kid's name put forward? Many parents say no.
That's right. The key is secrecy. The key is not knowing. So to key to policies like this, where you can do an end run around parents and undermine a parent's authority to advise their child on what might be the best, career options for them, the key is that the parent's not knowing. So if the parents get in the way, now we have a federal policy that circumvents the parents to get directly to the children. And of course we know the implications of this. A kid who's having a tough time in school perhaps, suddenly a recruiter comes along offering money and whatnot. I recently did another story for Mother Jones looking at what happens to some of these kids who are in the military, who are being sent to Iraq, or in the case of some of them are now fleeing the country to go to Canada to apply for asylum so that they don't have to go fight in Iraq. One fellow from Fort Hood, Texas, a fellow named Brandon Huey, is now in Toronto, where his case will soon be heard before a refugee board there. He was at Fort Hood in Texas, and he talked about why he signed up. Basically, a recruiter found him, offered him a $5,000 signing bonus, told him there's no way he'd be going to Iraq because that war will be over by the time, he gets through boot camp and all that. Well, lo and behold, the next thing is a knock on his door saying, pack up, we're going to Iraq in 24 hours. He sat on his bed with a knife in one hand, ready to slash his wrists, and a phone in the room. And he did some and of course many soldiers are now, the suicide rate has spiked in the military as people feel helpless, bound by decisions that they are making as 16 and 17-year-olds, suddenly landing them in the trenches of a far-off country, being forced to kill or be killed. So he ended up finding the name of an peace activist in Indianapolis. He's in Texas, and this peace activist says, well, you get yourself to Indianapolis and I'll get you across the border to Canada. It's the Underground Railroad all over again.
Talking about freedom of speech, there's the case of Ward Churchill, who was trying to speak up. He has Native American heritage, and is just being vilified in the process.
There is a serious crackdown on campus all over the country. Professors being put on notice, you be careful. I mean, the university is supposed to be the center of critical thinking and discussion. You discuss unpopular ideas, you dissect popular ideas, and you feel safe to do it. That makes this country safer. In fact, the media in this country should be a place that provides the forum for dissent. That's what makes this country healthy.
Oh, and one of the things that fascinated me was that you point out in your book about this distortion of what's going on entirely has been corrupted, so that instead of being innocent until proven guilty, now you're guilty until proven innocent.
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with the media defines what the boundaries of debate are. So when the media functions as essentially an extension of the PR operation of government, we have the results are catastrophic, and we're living with the consequences of that now, where we had unchallenged for 2 years the media acting as a conveyor belt for the lies of the Bush administration. And it wasn't that we didn't know then. Many people knew in government. Many critics were saying, there's nothing there. This is ideology, Bush administration ideology, parading as policy, as supposed intelligent, all of it fake, of course. So I think now, more than most other times, we see that these are life and death issues about whether or not what you read in the morning paper or see on the evening news is propaganda or is critical, hard-hitting, skeptical reporting, which is all that we're asking. You mentioned I.F. Stone before. We quote him in our book in a comment that he made to a group of journalism students where he said, if you remember only two things to do your jobs well, it's this: governments lie. If today's journalists kept that axiom in mind, think of how different our news would be if they approached what they were told skeptically, with an eye towards that it's not true until proven so. Think of how different the tone of our news would be. It might look like, in fact, what the rest of the world sees when they see the news of, say, the war in Iraq. They see a catastrophe. They see a policy gone off the rails. What do we see? We see self-congratulatory administration officials saying that things are going pretty much as they thought it would be and that everything's just fine.
Someone once quipped, the difference between Al Jazeera and the U.S. media is the U.S. media shows the missiles taking off. Al Jazeera shows where they land.
One of the things I found really admirable about the book is you connect all the points. I mean, when you're talking about the psychological propaganda that's going on as a military operation, I watched the media pretty carefully, and I think you really put your finger on how this is working now, and it's just absolutely horrifying that there's this much deliberate, malicious distortion of the public discourse.
What you're referring to is a chapter in our book called PsyOps Comes Home, the chapter. We rely in that chapter on a retired military psychological warfare expert. So we can't claim credit for this. This is someone from inside the military who is recognizing what is going on, what is being passed off as news by the Pentagon and the Bush administration as classic PsyOps techniques.
PsyOps, of course, being psychological operations, winning the hearts and minds of populations overseas.
And so this is not some wild-eyed conspiracy theorist. This is the guy who did this work. There's just one big problem, and that's that in his work, it is illegal to carry out psychological operations domestically in the U.S. PsyOps has always, by law, been reserved for overseas consumption. It is intended to deceive, quote, the enemy or people outside our borders. So since the 40s, when a law was passed forbidding this, you couldn't do this at home. So he is seeing his techniques being used against the American population to scare, deceive, distort, and essentially shape public opinion. So it is very chilling that laws are being openly flouted with a wink and a nod in an effort to basically keep people in a state of bafflement.
One of the questions was on my mind: how did the two of you get into this stance as more activists?
Well, I'd say for starters, we're inspired by our parents who did the same thing in their own worlds. They were peace activists. My mother established a nuclear freeze organization in our community. My father was with Physicians for Social Responsibility and helped to integrate the schools of our community as head of a task force that did that. And watching him up against hundreds of people screaming at night in the school cafeterias, they didn't want busing, they didn't want integration, seeing how he patiently guided people to a more just place. And my mother teaching women's literature and history at local community colleges, bringing out the voices of people who are not usually heard. I think that very much shaped us growing up, and both of us being active on our school papers. I mean, David's younger than I am, and he recruited us, his sister and brothers, with his own newspaper when he was much younger. I think I was the envelope stuffer. But Dave's press signs were all over our house, and there would be arrows pointing to his room. And he would put out a monthly newspaper, which was basically documenting what we did every day. But Dave was militant about telling the truth. And so even though he's my younger brother, he inspired me. And then it got bigger because we were active in our high school newspaper and saw that as a means for, as a means at working towards social justice and bettering our community.
We were taught growing up to question. At the dinner table, there was a lot of questioning. Becoming a journalist was really a natural extension of that. So if we grew up asking questions, and maybe as we got older asking tougher questions, it wasn't a big leap. So then when you look at this book and the work that we do now, I would just say, you know, journalism at its heart is a very simple craft. It's asking real and genuine hard questions to get at what's really going on. So I think what journalism has evolved into is really, does not represent the highest callings, or I would say even the most simple callings.
And yet still, young people go into it for the right reasons. Idealistic, wanting to document what's happening, wanting to expose the conditions of people who can't speak for themselves. But it gets filtered out over time, figuring out what makes you rise in your career, that to ask the tough questions, to ask questions about the conventional wisdom marginalizes you. That's a very serious problem. We have to bring journalism back to its roots, and it's also why I want to congratulate you for doing this program on public access, because I think that community cable television, community radio, public radio and television, these are the spaces that we must protect. They are our national treasures. Independent media is critical in a time of war.
And they're under attack also.
Mm-hmm.
Even here in Ann Arbor, there's moves being made by the city to take away the funding and use it for other purposes.
It's so often the case. In the same way that Pacifica Radio was built, belief that we needed a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists, media activists carved out the space of public access TV, that if a cable company comes into town, only one gets the monopoly, because the town doesn't want you to dig up the roads more than once to lay the cables. And in exchange for that monopoly, the cable company has to give a few channels, 1, 2, in big cities 3, 4. And that's public access TV, where people in the community can make their own media. Then when they go to renegotiate, they try to take it back. Or perhaps the city council tries to defund it. But it's very important when there's a constituency, when there are people that are making the media and people who are watching, that they come together and say, no, the media institutions now are the most powerful places on earth. It's the way that we come to understand each other. Community media is critical for dialogue about the most important issues of the day. So I hope people here in Ann Arbor, like in so many places around the country, fight back and ensure that you protect this national treasure. Most people get their information from television, so you have an invaluable resource here. It must be protected.
Well, and that's exactly what we started, was that we started the program in 1996 because the academic presses were talking about cutting back on publishing academic authors. And so we came up with the idea of talking with academic authors on television.
I mean, David's first book was with an academic press, University of California, on South Africa, called Fault Lines. Very important academic presses as a place to really get into issues.
Well, and it's wonderful topics. You know, it's not dull and dusty stuff. This is
well, and increasingly so. It's fallen to academic presses to do the serious journalism and the hard-hitting political issues, because fewer and fewer trade presses will touch these things anymore.
And there's not much marketing going on at all with them. And what you're pointing out about community is, I think, really important. You have to build the community. But I think, like you're talking about the military people that have helped you understand those, psychological operations. There's other people who are starting to resist this idea that we ought to have easy answers. And the other thing I think we must talk about is that you put your finger on who really owns the commercial media. And and then that they have a vested interest in making more.
Right. I mean, right now, media moguls are gobbling up the media landscape of this country. It doesn't matter how many channels there are. What matters is who the media moguls are that own them, and there are fewer and fewer of these owners. I come from Pacifica Radio, founded by a World War II conscientious objector who deeply felt the effects of a media beating the drums for war. And now it's 5 stations, you know, in Berkeley, KPFA, and KPFK in Los Angeles, our station in New York, WBAI, WPFW in Washington, KPFT in Houston. It's a very noble network. 56 years later, continues to be the only independent media network broadcasting in this country. Public access TV, absolutely critical. And I mean, we're living in a time of the clear channeling of America. When one company like Clear Channel can own over 1,200 radio stations and Clear Channel in music from other states. We need local media. There also, though, it's not just a bleak picture, because media activists are fighting back. And those media activists are across the political spectrum. When Michael Powell, son of Colin Powell helps lead the war in Iraq, his son leads the war on diversity of voices at home as chair of the FCC, trying to launch the largest media consolidation this country has ever seen. When he tried to do this, everyone from Trent Lott on the far right to Barbara Boxer raked him over the coals in the Senate and said, what are you doing? This instinctive feeling that it's not healthy for one media mogul to own a newspaper, radio, and television station in a town, that cuts down the discourse, that forces through just one point of view. And millions of people said no in Congress and to the FCC, that we have to allow a broader diversity of ownership. And when you have public media, like public access TV, we have to protect it.
You're absolutely right. One of the things that also has been disturbing, we're talking about the distortions that are going on, is how people are just detained somewhere under the Patriot Act. Guantanamo Bay, federal holding cells, they're taken, apparently don't even have to give any particular charges for a long time or ever. That violates the whole sense to me of the civil rights and constitutional rights of the average citizen.
There have been thousands of people detained since September 11th, and we don't know the charges against them. They don't know the charges. Is this really the American way? Is this what we want to represent to the rest of the world? And then this idea that we're just learning about of extraordinary rendition, where a person is sent to a country like Egypt or Syria to be tortured, sent by the United States. This is not what represents the best of America.
Well, I want to thank you for appearing on Rip Rap. I'm a fan of your program, Democracy Now! It's really a refreshing antidote to some of this pablum that's being spewed around on the 500 channels, more or less. So thank you for coming on Rip Rap.
Thank you so much, and thank you for doing this program.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thanks.